Epidemiology from San Diego State University and with a residency in OBGYN at Cedars Sinai Medical Center. She is an adjunct assistant professor at the UAB School of Medicine, and she will be leading the Utah Department of Health this summer to become the director of the Salt Lake County Department of Health. Please thank her for her extraordinary effort in combating the coronavirus disease in Utah.
Go ahead, Angela. I don't know if you could hear your long introduction, but you were introduced.
I heard that, but is there any way you can turn that computer around so I can actually see the students? Nice, perfect, awesome, thank you. Okay, well, good afternoon, and I apologize for not being in person. It would be so fun to see you guys, but just didn't have the time to get back and forth between a press conference and meetings in the afternoon, but it is so fun to meet with you and talk with you. These are the meetings I love the most because it makes me remember why I love my job and why I love what I do, and so happy to answer any questions. Please feel free to interrupt at any moment. I do have, okay, I can share my screen. Oh, host disabled participant screen sharing.
We don't trust everybody to share screens here. So.
I wouldn't either.
Let me make you, I'm gonna make you like the host or whatever.
Okay. All righty. So I was asked to, can you guys see my screen? Cool. So I was asked to talk to you today a little bit about kind of how I got to where I am, what I do, and then definitely answer any questions you guys might have that either pertains to your interest and what you want to do or just out of curiosity. So don't hold anything back. So who am I? So first, I am a mom and a wife. I've got two rowdy young boys, a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old. We like to do a lot of outdoor adventures and have fun here in Utah. We have 2 Great Danes. That's Noemi and Gus, who definitely keep us on our toes as well. And I went to medical school. So this is one of my best friends from med school. So you heard my intro, went to Brown as an undergrad, did international relations and political economy and development. And I'll go through kind of my route to medical school and public health in a little bit. So I am currently the state epidemiologist, and prior to COVID, nobody except for 50 state epidemiologists, because there's one in each state, probably had a clue as to what a state epidemiologist was. Many people at the beginning of this pandemic could not pronounce epidemiologist. And so this is definitely a new lingo for a lot of people, and certainly a once in a lifetime opportunity for this position to be in the limelight. And we all now have awesome vests. And yes, that vest is the state epidemiologist of Oregon. I haven't gotten that yet, but it does make him look pretty official. And I'm going to be leaving on June 1 to be the executive director and local health officer of Salt Lake County. So just a little background of public health. Every state has one state epidemiologist. They're generally a physician. Some have doctorate levels in epidemiology or public health, and they serve to kind of guide that public health strategy in terms of what data do we need to collect? What are the important health things going on in the world? And of course, how do we respond to infectious disease outbreaks? In my new position, I'll be just over Salt Lake County. So instead of the whole state and guiding the strategy of the whole state, I'll be closer to the community, focused on one county, and it's the county I live in. And it provides the opportunity to be a little bit more granular and I guess on the ground in terms of things we do. So in the state of Utah, we have 13 local health jurisdictions. Most of them are single counties. So Salt Lake County, Wasatch County that you're in, Davis County, et cetera. There are a couple that are multiple counties just because they're so small. So the southwest of Utah, the southeast, they in Tri-County Health Department, they combine multiple counties to make one health department. But these 13 local health departments serve individuals in their jurisdictions, and they work together with the state health department to do public health. And Salt Lake County is responsible for these kind of niche ads throughout COVID. They definitely have the ability to be a little bit more innovative and push the envelope a little bit in terms of messaging out there than we do at the state, because they're just targeting their own specific community. So a little bit about how I got here. And this is just for your information, if it happens to help you or be interesting to you. And I'll just stop sharing because I didn't make slides about my history. But so I grew up mostly in Texas and a little bit in Chicago as well. My dad was in the oil fields and kind of worked his way up the corporate ladder. So we moved around a lot. Going into college, I was recruited to play volleyball. So I played volleyball at Brown. And I remember sitting down with my coach my freshman year, and she's like, "What are you going to major in?" And I said, "Well, I think I want to do med school. I think I'm going to do pre-med." And she said, "Well, you're likely not going to be able to play volleyball and do pre-med because it's just too much classwork." And I was a very impressionable 18-year-old. And so I said, "Oh, okay." And just threw pre-med off the table and looked at doing things like art history and journalism, and eventually landed on international relations and really focused on negotiating, coming to how leaders come to consensus with other leaders, and how politics informs an economy. And so that's what I focused on, did my thesis on the Russian ballet, and then took Spanish throughout college. So kind of this like very liberal arts background in college. But at the start of my senior year, when you're starting to figure out kind of what you want to do after college, I really didn't have any ideas. My summers in college were spent. After my freshman year, I worked on an oil tanker, thanks to my father. I've learned to never go to him without a job again, because that's what I did when I came home from college, and he put me on an oil tanker. We sailed from Valdez, Alaska, all the way down to Los Angeles and back, and I chipped paint and painted the deck and cleaned the deck for 3 months. And then I worked in New York City for a public relations firm doing live music events. And then, God, I didn't learn my lesson, because then I went back to Alaska and worked on the North Slope of Alaska the last summer, which is an oil field. And the kids, which I was one, picks up all the debris from the winter because of all the winter storms, and picks up the debris for the summer. So very glamorous positions, and still didn't know what I wanted to do my senior year. And at the suggestion of one of my friends, just started taking science classes. So started out with biology and chemistry in my senior year, was in a class with a bunch of freshmen and liked it, and decided to keep pursuing science. And that meant that I had to do additional undergrad work after I graduated from Brown. At that point, I was very sick of the Northeast. Brown is in Providence, Rhode Island, and they have terrible weather. And I went down to Miami, Florida, where there were palm trees and an ocean and white sand, and did all of my pre-med requirements. So went back to undergrad, basically, at the University of Miami, and did all of my pre-med in 2 years, and then went to med school. Stayed in Miami for med school, did an intern year in OBGYN. After medical school. Is kind of one of those things. Med school trains people to become physicians, right? And we all think of a doctor, we think of someone who sees a patient in an office one-on-one, or does surgery in a hospital, or treats patients who are really sick in a hospital. And I pretty much knew my third year of med school, when we started doing rotations in the hospital, that one-on-one patient care really wasn't for me. And I'll explain that a little further. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? Why go to all the trouble and the debt of going to med school and not want to treat patients? But I was really frustrated by our healthcare system at that point. I did rotations in a public hospital in Miami, a lot of uninsured and undocumented patients. And it was definitely a revolving door for a lot of preventable illness. But the thing that got me was seeing really young people with really advanced diseases. And they only advanced because they couldn't get the care they needed to keep their disease manageable when they were young. So one case really struck me. I was doing my ER rotation, and a 20-something-year-old man, otherwise really healthy, came in and wasn't able to eat, couldn't keep food down, was losing weight. And in the emergency room, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and it was stage 4 at that point. Hodgkin's lymphoma is something that generally, when diagnosed really early, is very manageable and curable. And here was this young man at the end stage of cancer, unable to eat and being diagnosed in an ER. And it was that pivotal moment where I thought, this isn't right. And instead of being that doctor to treat this individual, which is so important, but my passion was, how do I make sure this doesn't happen to another individual? How can I change the system to make sure that people have access to care before it gets so bad that they have to go to the ER and basically be sentenced to death? So that third year of med school really changed my perception of what I wanted to do with my career. And at that point in med school counselors don't know what to do with a med student who doesn't want to treat patients. So they didn't have a lot of advice for me. So I ended up doing an intern year in OBGYN and quickly found out that I was better suited for preventive medicine and public health. So finished up residency in that, did primary care for a year, and then a fellowship with the CDC. And that's how I landed in Utah. So the CDC fellowship is the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And it's focused on building a workforce for responding to outbreaks. And I'll talk about the outbreaks I did. And you can be stationed in Atlanta or a state health department. And I chose a state health department. And that's how I came to Utah. So definitely had a focus from the beginning of kind of my formal career of wanting to do more population health and wanting to be involved in health policy and public health, and kept seeking out those opportunities, whether it was doing research or doing a fellowship to get to where I am today. Hold on, let's go back to sharing my screen. There we go. So I'm going to run through some really fun outbreaks that I've been part of, and then would love to hear your questions and want to make sure that I answer anything you are thinking about. But outbreaks are really fun, and that is the quintessential thing a physician in public health does, or a state epidemiologist does. Now, we are all fluent in that language, right, with COVID, but before COVID, there was a lot of stuff going on. So I'll run through some outbreaks and would love to get kind of your opinion on kind of how these played out and what you think is going on. So this happens often. Actually, Wasatch County has a bunch of these too. I don't think this dairy is in Wasatch County, but this was the first outbreak I did when I came to Utah. This is a dairy that sells raw milk, and we had a lot of cases come in that were sick. And they were all sick with the same bug. It's called Campylobacter. It is a bug that is commonly found in raw milk and can cause people to have a lot of gastrointestinal symptoms, right? Like diarrhea, vomiting. And generally people get over it pretty okay. But if they have other health problems, like liver problems, or they're immunocompromised for some other reason, or if they're really young, like an infant or under the age of 1, something like this can really cause severe problems and even death. So this is the dairy, and the way we found out about an outbreak, again, was a bunch of cases were notified to the public health department. They were getting sick from diarrhea and vomiting. And when we called them to do the case investigation, the vast majority of them said they had drank raw milk from this dairy. So then we go to the dairy to inspect it. When you're inspecting a dairy, this is the bulk tank on your left-hand side here, where they put all the milk. So in order to make that connection, so we had the epi connection, the epidemiologic connection, which is all your cases, and they're clustered in time and place and risk factor, right? So a bunch of people had similar symptoms around the same time, and they were all connected to dairy A. But now let's see if the milk actually has the bug in it. So this is the dairy farmer taking some milk from the bulk tank, and that would go to a lab to see if it had Campylobacter in it that matched what our cases had. The other thing you want to do is test the cows. So Campylobacter is a bacteria that is found in raw milk. And the reason why it's found in raw milk is because it comes from the cow's GI tract. Basically, it's cow poop that gets into the milk somehow. And because the milk isn't pasteurized, the bacteria is allowed to grow and can cause people to get sick. And so another thing you do in addition to testing the raw milk is actually test the poop of the cows to see if they have Campylobacter in it as well. And so this is something called an epicurve, and I'll show you other ones for other outbreaks. But on the, oh, it's a little hard to see, sorry about that. But on the x-axis is our number of cases, and on the y-axis is the dates. Did I mess that up, the X and Y? Yeah. Well, okay, so you've got the dates, and then you do the number of cases on your bars. Here we have probable and confirmed, and that's common public health language. Confirmed generally means that you have a lab test that shows they actually had a disease that's connected to the dairy. And probable means you weren't able to get that lab test, but they did have all the symptoms and they drank milk and it was in the same time frame. So you can see here we had 99 cases. So the outbreak had an N of 99 and we had the most cases. It started to peak in June. And the way you control a raw milk outbreak is to have the dairy stop selling raw milk. So you can see at the beginning of August, the permit to sell raw milk was suspended. And almost immediately after it was suspended, no more raw milk was sold from the dairy and our cases dropped. And because they dropped so low, the permit was reinstated. So they were allowed to sell raw milk again. Well, right after they started being able to sell raw milk again in October, the cases started popping up again. And then the Department of Agriculture decided to revoke their permit completely until they were able to clean up their operations. So this is a very clean, typical outbreak where you see the number of cases peak and then the intervention causes the cases to drop, and you know that you've made the right association between the dairy and the cases. So we always look at like the description of our cases as well to see if there's any common factors and how can you prevent the next one. And you can see right here under confirmed. So they had Campylobacter jejuni, and the pattern, the PFG pattern, which is basically the DNA thumbprint of the bacteria they all matched. And 58% of our cases had Campylobacter and the DNA fingerprint that matched it. And 54% of our cases said they drank raw milk at Dairy A. So you're not going to always get 100% because people forget, people lie. That's just the way it goes. But when you get this kind of overwhelming majority, it's a really strong indicator that the two are connected. Okay, any questions so far before I move to the measles outbreak? I don't see any. Okay, cool. So this is another very typical outbreak, but we're moving to virals, vaccine preventable diseases. I don't know if you guys remember this. In 2015, there was a huge measles outbreak that extended nationally that was linked to Disneyland. And you can see they said thousands of vaccinated people here didn't get measles. But they did have a lot of people that got measles and spread it to other states, and Utah is included in that. This is just a sample of our response. So in January, we had 2 cases that were related, and they had measles symptoms, and they went to their pediatrician, and the pediatrician actually recognized it as measles. So rash, fever, and this is rare because there's not a lot of measles around anymore. So young physicians might not recognize measles when they see it, but luckily this pediatrician was a little older and was able to identify it quickly as measles, which allowed those cases to know that they were contagious to other people, and he alerted public health really quickly. So the minute that happened, we started identifying anybody who was susceptible to measles who had come into contact with these 2 people. So this might seem similar to COVID. We have cases with an infectious disease, and then public health tries to identify everybody who's susceptible that may have been exposed to that disease. Susceptible here when you're talking about measles is unvaccinated. So identifying all the unvaccinated individuals who are exposed to them and putting them into quarantine and active monitoring. So the big thing when you look at this kind of exposure is, where did these people go when they were infectious? So where did the 2 measles cases go that they could have exposed a bunch of other people? They had been to 52 public events, including like a movie theater, a grocery store, and the mall. They had gone to their pediatric office and exposed 156 people. And then they had gone to several private events because this was over the holiday period, and they had exposed an additional 151 people. So these 2 individuals had exposed 385 people when they were infectious with measles. So of those, I guess we identified 3 more. Of the nearly 400, nearly 70% of them were susceptible. So people, it tends, we all tend to hang out with people who are like us. And in the US, we have clusters of unvaccinated individuals who tend to socialize together and live together, and it was evident here. And so nearly 70% were deemed susceptible, and 55% ended up being placed on quarantine for 21 days. And if you haven't been schooled as to what quarantine is with COVID, that just means that you actually are in your house and can't go around other susceptible people for 21 days in case you end up getting sick with measles. You don't want to spread it.
You'll like this, Angela. Who in here has been quarantined?
Nice. There, see, I'm speaking to experts.
They're well versed in the quarantine world.
That's what I thought. I know. So I guess hopefully this presentation makes you guys all realize that this is basically what we've gone through with COVID happens almost with every single outbreak. COVID just happens to be tons of people. So measles, we only had 150, so 55% ended up being quarantined, but that's because we have such a high vaccination rate. If this was COVID, they would have all been quarantined. So the next big outbreak, I think I've got this one, and then we'll talk about Ebola. This was hepatitis C, which is a little interesting. So hepatitis C is a virus. It's spread through blood generally. And we were identified an individual. So you can see, I have to move my little box. Okay. So way on the right-hand side of this, in early 2015, the CDC contacted us and said that, there's a Utahan who has hepatitis C and has no risk factors for it. So the risk factors for hepatitis C are things like tattoos, using intravenous drugs. Those are your biggest risk. We found out he had Hep C, so working backwards, because he had donated blood in November and had a positive Hep C test. So when you donate blood, they screen you for all these bloodborne pathogens, and he was found out to be positive in November. We knew he was negative before that because he donated blood a lot, and in September he was negative. So this kind of set off a lot. Oh, I didn't realize this was animated. This set off a lot of alarms. And so we started to look through his healthcare exposures. So one thing we do with Hep C is if they don't have any of the normal risk factors, we look at healthcare and try to figure out where could have he been exposed in a healthcare setting. Obviously, he gave blood in September. He went to an emergency department in October, and he got his teeth cleaned in the middle of October. So when we looked into it a little bit further, we ended up figuring out that the hospital he went to, the emergency room, he was treated by a healthcare provider who had been fired because she had been diverting drugs. So drug diversion in the healthcare setting means basically stealing drugs that are intended for a patient and then using it for their personal use. And so his nurse in this emergency room was fired for diverting Dilaudid and morphine, which are 2 pain medications, really strong pain medications. And both of those are used, given to patients via needle. When we looked further into this healthcare provider's history, we found that she worked at another hospital, Hospital B, prior to moving to Hospital A, and she was fired because she was stealing intravenous Benadryl. So she went from Hospital B, was fired for stealing intravenous Benadryl, and then went to Hospital A and was fired for stealing Dilaudid and morphine. Of note, Benadryl, maybe it feels a little weird that somebody would be stealing Benadryl. You can get it over the counter, But Benadryl is actually for people who are on really high opioids like morphine or heroin or Dilaudid. Benadryl stops some of the side effects. So people get really shaky and itchy when they're on high doses of opioids, and Benadryl can prevent those side effects. And so there was some thought here that perhaps she was using it because she was having side effects from illicit drugs. So it turned out that that healthcare provider was our index patient's exposure. So the patient at the beginning who had Hep C ended up getting it from his nurse that treated him in the emergency room who had a substance abuse problem. And so we ended up having to work with the hospital to figure out everybody that she may have exposed. So nearly 7,217 people were exposed, and testing for hepatitis C was offered to all of them. Half were tested, 60 were infected with hepatitis C, and 17 with hepatitis C genotype 2B. So hepatitis C is a virus, and there's all these different kind of strains or types of the virus. This healthcare provider who had a substance abuse problem had the genotype 2B. And what's interesting here is that's a really, really rare genotype. So it allowed us to make the connection between these patients and the nurse. Because 2B is so rare that the fact that they all have it makes you a little suspicious, right? The other thing that you can do, and we've learned a little bit about this with COVID. We talk about the different variants that are coming with COVID, and we have to do whole genome sequencing to see what type everybody has. Well, it's the same with hepatitis C. So this is a picture of all the different variants of hepatitis C, if you will, and you can see where they cluster. So each of these colored dots with a UT and then a number are one of our patients that had hepatitis C 2B. And the gray circle means that they are all related. So there's not a big difference in their DNA to make them from two different sources. So all the patients in the gray circle had the same virus in them, which is related to the Utah-1, UT1 on the bottom left hand, and that is our nurse. And so it's very clear evidence that they all share the same virus. What this can't do is tell you who gave the virus to whom, right? So like Utah 32 could have given it to Utah 2 or vice versa. But that's where the epi evidence comes in. So this is the lab evidence, and then the epi evidence is that person, place, and time in terms of who was infected when, and you can kind of chart out how the infections went. Any questions about Hep C? Okay, no quarantine needed for Hep C, just people to get treated. So everybody that was identified as having hepatitis C did get treatment. So that's a good thing, right? To be identified early for something like that. All right, now Ebola. We'll talk about Ebola, and then we'll ask or answer some questions. So I started my fellowship with the CDC in the summer of 2014, and we have a summer course, and it's in July. And I remember them talking about the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. It was just starting. And in a weird way, we were all very excited about that, because being able to respond to an Ebola outbreak is like such a cool thing from an epi perspective. It's like your quintessential public health outbreak. And so I had the fortune to learn about it and then also respond. So the 2014-2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa was the largest ever Ebola outbreak. And I'm saying that ever because we now have a vaccine for it. And for example, in the DRC in Guinea right now, they've got some clusters of Ebola, but they're not exploding because we have a vaccine, and public health practitioners are able to go in there and vaccinate everybody who's been exposed, preventing the virus from spreading more. But we did not have that in 2014, 2015, and I'll show you kind of what happens there. The reason why this was such a large outbreak is because it was the first urban outbreak. All of the Ebola outbreaks prior to this one were in these really remote settings in Africa that really wreaked a lot of havoc on villages, but didn't really go beyond that. But here we had it in an urban community, multiple countries, and the first case was identified in December 2013. So this is the kind of timeline of cases for the Ebola outbreak. That red circle is when I ended up going to Sierra Leone. So right as it was starting to peak, I was going to Sierra Leone. I was placed, so this is Sierra Leone, and I was placed in the middle of Sierra Leone in a village called Tonkalili. You can see Freetown over here on the left-hand side of the screen. Freetown is where the airport is. It's where the big hotels are. That's where the CDC was stationed. And it's about, I don't know, a 7-hour drive or so into the middle of Tonkalili where I was. And, you know, you think you're going in to be this big like problem solver and identify cases. But when I got to Tonkalili, I was the first CDC representative there, helping out with the local health department there. So there was a lot of infrastructure that needed to happen. So when you go into epidemiology and public health, you kind of have to be a jack of all trades. And if you're not, you have to be able to kind of just pick things up quickly and go with the flow and do the best you can. And this is a situation that definitely highlights that. So when I got there, there was a lot of logistics that needed to happen. We didn't have electricity all the time. And so it was coming in and out. There was no internet. We had no fuel for our motorbikes or our vehicles, and we only had a few vehicles to be able to go do contact tracing. So securing those things was the first step that I had to take when I got there. They also had no framework. And so you guys might be fluent in this language now too. We had no way of doing case surveillance, so identifying new cases or doing any contact tracing. None of that framework was made, and there was no lab and patient tracking, right? So we all take for granted what we have for COVID in Utah, where we've got this public dashboard, and every week we tell you how many new cases we have, and if you want to find it every day, you can go on the dashboard and see that, and it's automated through labs reporting directly into our surveillance system. None of that was happening during Ebola in West Africa. The other thing was advocacy. There's really limited resources, right? So one example is our hospital needed a generator, and there was only one available. So you have to like advocate for your hospital to be the one to get a generator. And who's going to hire and train the contact tracers? There's a lot of stigma around Ebola. And so a lot of people didn't want to be associated with it. And but we needed someone to do it. And another really sad time where we had to have a lot of advocacy was orphaned infants. So their parents died of Ebola, and the infants needed formula, but there wasn't any funding or ability to get it to them. So trying to figure out those things was definitely part of the job. So this is the health department I worked at, the Tonkalili District Primary Health Complex. This was my office, and we did end up getting internet and electricity. And then all of my Tonkalili colleagues decided to use my office because it was the one office with internet and electricity. So it was hard to get stuff done. Oh, you know, it was so hot. We did contact tracing. So this is my colleague, Captain Red, and we'd have to go and talk with the village leader, whatever village we were going to try to get good contact tracing done. And there is a lot of mistrust of the government, you know, not dissimilar from COVID. And getting trusted voices on board was really, really important to get good contact tracing done to stop the spread of Ebola in these communities. This is the ambulance team. So I was responsible for training our ambulance team to practice good infection control practices to keep themselves safe when they were transporting Ebola patients. What's really sad here is that these 5 individuals were ostracized from their communities when they decided to drive ambulances for Ebola patients, and they were kicked out of their families and their homes and lived at the hospital to be able to perform this work. So tons of stigma around it. They did really hard work. So they were the ones who would have to transport patients when they passed away. And that's when somebody is at the highest infection level, is when they pass away for Ebola. And so they have to wear, you know, a lot of personal protective equipment in really hot situations. I will say that this gentleman in the picture ended up passing away from Ebola about 2 weeks after I left. He was transporting patients, again, on like an 8-hour trip on really bad roads. And they're supposed to wear kind of this full gear while they're driving. His glasses were fogging up, and he took them off. And when he took it off, he saw vomit spreading from the back of the ambulance to the front because it wasn't sealed properly. And he ended up contracting Ebola that way. There was actually a piece in the New Yorker written up about him and his struggles. So really scary disease, but the communities that committed themselves and ultimately their lives to trying to help their friends and families and loved ones really took a huge challenge and risk. This is the lab. This is the lab that was used to test blood for Ebola. Crazy, right? I mean, it's like in a random room with just a fan and open windows. Definitely spare resources there. But this was the CDC lab in Sierra Leone. Contact tracing. So we know what contact tracing is now, right? You figure out who is exposed to a disease and you tell them to watch for symptoms and stay home so they don't spread it. And it was so hard to do contact tracing in Sierra Leone. So there was very porous borders between Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, different languages spoken and governments that didn't talk to each other. So communities could cross borders really easily and you would lose track of them. They are very, very mobile. And then you had this huge geographic breadth with very limited infrastructure. So it was really hard to actually get places. Because of that, there were several containment strategies that went into place. And some of these will seem familiar to what we have done with COVID. There were checkpoints. So we don't necessarily have checkpoints, but I'm sure you've all had your temperature taken, right? So every so often when you're driving, you would be at a checkpoint and they would check you for a fever. And if you had a fever, you were not allowed to continue. This is my colleague getting his temperature checked. They also did lockdowns and went house to house looking for cases. So they would tell everybody to stay home, and then we'd have community health workers go door to door assessing people for Ebola symptoms, because a lot of times individuals wouldn't want to present themselves because they were scared. We had community care centers. So a big problem with Ebola was people, similar to COVID, right? At the beginning of this, people were afraid to go get healthcare for their normal things, right? If they were pregnant, if they had diabetes or just a cold, they wouldn't go get healthcare. And so we ended up setting up community care centers that were for people who had no symptoms of Ebola to try to encourage people to still get their normal healthcare. And this is another example of a Ebola treatment center. So you've got your community care center here, and then your Ebola treatment center here, where in these tents to the right here were stretchers with patients on them with who had Ebola. And then you have your Ebola clinicians here kind of taking a break. But they were just out kind of tents in the middle of land because there were so many cases. And then of course, vaccination. And I don't have a slide on this, but vaccination was being tested in 2014. And now, as I mentioned earlier, is a huge reason why Ebola is contained now and has not caused a problem coming to other countries. It has been really low transmission rates because the vaccines are working so well. And again, we see this with COVID too, right? It's amazing how infectious diseases are all really similar in terms of what they respond to, but getting people immune through vaccination is really one of the best ways. And similar to COVID, Ebola has effects way beyond the actual disease. They had economic effects, right? We had this with COVID. With West Africa, they had trade and travel restrictions, so they couldn't do their normal businesses. Their agriculture was disrupted, so they actually disrupted a planting season, which led to decreased harvest and hunger the following year. Mining is huge in West Africa, and all those operations were suspended. And then, of course, the health effects beyond Ebola of tuberculosis, malaria, other common respiratory diseases, their mortality rates increased during Ebola because people weren't seeking care. And this is the beach in Sierra Leone, which I love. They have such a beautiful beach. I'm a sucker for oceans. Anyway, if you ever get the opportunity to go to West Africa, I'd highly recommend it. So that's kind of a whirlwind of what I do. I would love to answer any questions or feedback, anything you guys have to say.
Sarah? Yeah, come on up.
So what's been like the hardest thing about being the state epidemiologist, and then also what's like the biggest lesson you learned during COVID and all of that.
Did you go on mute?
Sorry, I must have gone on mute when she started talking. So the hardest thing about being a state epi, and then what I've learned in COVID. So pre-COVID, I would say the hardest thing about being a state epidemiologist is that you have to make decisions really quickly with bad data, because you're not going to have all the information you need to make an actual well-informed decision. So you kind of have to do just the best you can, and be really flexible to try to make a different decision. And that all comes down on the state epidemiologist. But COVID played a little different role because of the politics of it. Never before have I seen science and politics been so intertwined. And that was really, really, really tough to navigate. So I think what I've learned from COVID is to bring in more stakeholders early on. So making sure that not just the health community is part of the response, but politicians, education, economics, et cetera, kind of trying to think about all those factors. Yeah.
Other questions? And you can just shout them out. I can relay them if you want. Okay.
So I have a question, like how the nurse was
So she's wondering how the nurse was able to spread the disease on the Hep C one.
Oh, sure. Good question. Absolutely. So we don't know specifically, but I will tell you kind of the scenario where it could happen. So what she was doing was taking, or what someone who would spread that could do. So a patient would be prescribed morphine, and it would be given in a needle, and she would give herself the morphine, like half of it, and then give the rest to the patient. So the same needle going in her and the patient. Or she would give herself all of it and then put saline in the patient. But ultimately it's during work, the needle going in both the nurse and the patient.
Other questions? Back in the back, we've got two. Go ahead, Aiden, and then Hunter.
Do you know what happened to the nurse?
Do you know what happened to the nurse that did that?
Yeah, and you can look it up on the news too. So she ended up getting tried federally and being convicted, and I think she's serving prison time.
Okay.
How many total years of schooling did it take?
I think I heard that. How many? Too many. So I like my first real job was after fellowship. But so I went to undergrad, so 4 years of college, 2 years of my pre-med, and then 4 years of med school, so 10. But then I did 3 years of residency and a 2-year fellowship. So that's an additional 5. But the residency and fellowship, you do get paid. Not a lot, but you do get paid, but it's not a real job. But so I would say 10 years post high school of official education. Oh, and I did my MPH. I didn't say that too, God. But I did my MPH during residency training. So another 2 years there. God, a lot. It was in my 30s before I was done. I wanted to go back to school. I was interested in law school or my MBA. My husband was like, no, no more school for you. Have to work.
If she can go back, would she focus on pre-med instead of volleyball?
If you could go back, would you focus on pre-med or volleyball, or pre-med instead of volleyball?
Oh, interesting. No, I love that I had a liberal arts background. A lot of people who go into med school know really early on that that's what they want to do. So they have a very specific course of sciences. I think having a broader view of the world and building relationships through volleyball and understanding, history and the political atmosphere of things was really good for me, and I love it. So I love having that big picture view. So I actually would not do anything differently. I feel really fortunate to have that broad liberal arts background and then focus on pre-med. It also, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it also allowed me to have more fun in my undergraduate years. Pre-med can be really intense. And so I was glad that I was able to do that after. And have a lot of fun during undergrad.
Other questions?
What's the future of COVID in Utah?
What's the future of COVID in Utah?
Yeah, so we're actually doing really fantastic right now. Our cases are starting to decrease, and our vaccinations are going up. I believe if you guys are all 16 and older, you are eligible for the vaccine, and we really need your age group to get vaccinated. 12 to 15-year-olds should be approved next week to get the Pfizer vaccine. In order for us to have, a normal summer, good extracurricular activities, and a normal fall, we really need our teens to get vaccinated. So that is the future, is continuing to get the young vaccinated so that life definitely goes back to what we knew it was like before COVID. But we're in a good spot. So if you haven't gotten your vaccine yet, sign up for it.
Hey, can I ask you to just share with them? So there's so much misinformation about this whole thing, right? And we all experience it in different ways, but
Yeah.
What would be your recommendation to people? Because I'm sure you have received a million nasty emails in your, I mean, we receive them at the school, so I'm sure you receive more than we do.
Sure.
But what has been your experience, and what would be your recommendation for people as a whole kind of going forward to be able to handle and find real information?
Sure. I mean, it's so hard. And I think I touched on this a bit because the politicization of science is really unique this past year. And unfortunate, because I think it's hard for the general public to kind of tease out those differences and who's right. And it's just tough. It's a really hard situation. But I would say, definitely talking to your healthcare provider is one way to do it. I know I'm going to say some government websites, but that doesn't work for everybody, right? Like CDC has great information. Our Utah coronavirus.utah.gov website has fantastic information out there. It's tough though. I would definitely stay away from kind of the mass media and social media. There's a lot of misinformation out there. And if you have a question about something, don't hesitate to ask your healthcare provider or your health department. A trusted resource like that is really important. The way we make decisions in a health perspective, it's all about health. None of us ever have a political angle or an economic angle. We just want to make sure people are staying safe and preventing as much death as we can. So I think just spreading that and encouraging people who may think otherwise to give that a second thought is important moving forward. But we're all here just to save lives and do good. And really that's the end of it. But I understand. It's been tough.
Any other questions? Madam? What are your average hours of work?
So COVID has sucked. So COVID has been probably around 60 to 70 hours a week. But without COVID, so what I love about public health is that it's typically this like normal 8 to 5 job, but you just don't know what's going to happen in the normal business hours. And there's a lot of variety to it. But about once or twice a year, you get a big exciting outbreak where you're working 14-hour days plus. But normally it's really normal hours, 8-hour days, really flexible.
Any more? Okay, well, Angela, we want to thank you for your time. Let's give Angela a round of applause. Really appreciate you spending time with us.
Yeah, thanks so much. You guys have a wonderful, wonderful weekend.
Okay, thank you.
Bye, guys.